In this video, we're going to talk about typographic classifications. These are really important in that we can kind of see the development of classifications over time and understand kind of how they came about. They're also helpful for pairing typefaces, and we'll talk more about that when you get to the lecture series on combining typefaces. Before we can start talking too much about classifications, first thing I want to mention is what serifs are. So when we look at serifs, we're looking at those decorative ends on the ends of the letters that are either going to be bracketed serifs or unbracketed serifs. So those are kind of those decorative ends that fall on the end of a letter form. So as we look here, we see these little yellow markers indicating the serifs within a typeface. Some typefaces that have serifs are Baskerville, Dido, and Rockwell. Now the reason I kind of picked some of these as my main three typefaces that utilize serifs is they kind of utilize a different type of serif for each. So Baskerville, if you look real close, you can see where the serif connects to the main body of the letter, the stem of the letter in this B. It's curved, right? And so it's more of a curved, bracketed meaning curved serif. This is also bracketed, and it's a curved kind of where the serif meets the letter form is curved, right? With Dido here, we have more of a unbracketed serif where it's kind of a right angle here. What you'll also notice about this serif, this is more a modern typeface classification, is that it's really thin compared to the letter form stroke within the D here. The shoulder of the D here is much more wide or heavy than this thin serif. And serifs that have very thin serif characteristic, the only issue with that is at smaller sizes, when you scale down this typeface, this little thin serif might start to disappear, especially at lower resolutions, right? Here we have a slab serif, and again we have an unbracketed, meaning where that serif meets the main letter form, it's kind of a right angle and corner here, it's not rounded. So that's a sans serif, a serif type of connection here with the letter R, and it is unbracketed, right? And so Rockwell is a slab serif, and what that means is it has the same thickness for the serif as the main thickness or stroke of the rest of the letter, right? So that's the same weight in the serif, or the same thickness echoed in the serif as throughout the rest of the letter. All right, so first classification we're talking about is black letter. So black letter has a real kind of an ornate or decorative type of feel to it. This was considered kind of very hard to read in large form because it's very decorative. It has a very heavy stroke weight, and black letter typefaces, the classification has a very high angle of stress. So left angle of stress here, very high, it kind of tilts. Little to no bracketed serif, high contrast and stroke weight. So you can see by that here, this part of the letter form here is very heavy, and then this is very light in terms of the stroke, very thin stroke here for the stroke weight. Terminals may not have serifs. It's highly decorative. So black letter is really one of those typefaces you'd probably save for like a header or a headline versus using it for your body copy, right? So if you would take a whole bunch of paragraphs of text and use black letter, that would be very difficult to read. In fact, going back to when the scribes were creating the penmanship for the Bible, right, or other books that were created at that time, one of the kind of downfalls of it was very difficult to read, and it took up a lot of space, and was very much hard to to position on a page, and therefore made it very difficult to read, right? So black letter is again best served for, you know, headlines or, you know, larger typeface, larger text on a page. Another classification is humanist or old style. Both words kind of mean the same here. So Saban and Garmund are two typefaces that fall under that classification. So again, you'll see a diagonal stress here when we look at the O. We'll see a bracketed serif here, so it's bracketed and then a really nice curve where the serif connects to the letter form. Low to medium contrast, so you can see there's a little bit of contrast between the thinnest point of the letter form versus the heaviest or thickest part of the letter form. Wedge-shaped serifs and angled head serif, right? So you can kind of see here we have more of a curved here and more of an angled here. So again, this is the humanist or old style typeface. And really, it seems to kind of carry on that, that style of if somebody was using a calligraphy, right? So calligraphy is very much the catalyst for this humanist or old style typeface. The next is transitional. So in this typeface, we kind of see a transition from what we'll see the previous humanist or old style to more of a modern. So it's kind of like that kind of transition between those two. So what we see here is a little more vertical stress. So again, not left-leaning stress. The bracketed serifs are a little straighter and sharper than humanist and old style. A more pronounced contrast than humanist or old style. And it's a slightly lighter than old style. So the typeface, the stroke weight is a little bit lighter than the previous version, which was the humanist or old style. Then we moved on to modern classification. So modern classification was, again, kind of a very much more variation in thick and thin parts of the letter form. So dramatic contrast between thick and thin strokes. The vertical stress is very straight up and down. Little to no bracketed serif. So again, it kind of has more of an angular transition between the serif and the main letter form. It can have more of those ball-shaped terminals. And again, this has more of a use for more of headers or larger typeface. Again, not something you would necessarily use for large bodies of text. It works good for larger text, but again, as you scale that text down or you apply it to paragraphs of text, it's a little bit harder on the eye to read, okay, because of those terminals, those extra decorative areas, or the real narrow, in this case with Dido, those very narrow serif here can get lost at a really small size. So the narrow set width is also a classification characteristic as well. The next classification we're going to talk about is the Egyptian, or more probably commonly referred to as slab serif. I love slab serifs. They work great for kind of headlines, those larger text on a page or a composition, kind of draws in the attention. They have a very vertical axis, little to no bracketed serif. So they're an unbracketed. So you can even see here, there's a slight kind of bracket here, but really it's pretty much of a straight angle where the letter form hits that serif. Virtually no contrast in stroke weight. So again, all the parts of this letter, the serif and the main body of the letter, are all equal in stroke weight. There's no kind of thick and thin quality to it. They have more of a heavy serif, so it's very thick as compared to previously the modern, which can have a very thin serif. So very thick serifs. and wide set width. So the set width is the width of a letter, right? So if we look at the letter A, the width of the letter compared to the width of the modern classification set width here, you can even see it's much thinner here than when we look at a slab serif. Now let's move on to sans serif. So Helvetica, Agenda Black, and Alternate Gothic are all examples of sans serif. And the reason I picked these three to kind of highlight is you can see a very different characteristic or between each of these typefaces. So Helvetica is tried and true, right? We've used that a lot for large bodies of text. It's really easy to read. It's great for display typeface uses. So when you're going to be using a typeface for display, Helvetica is a great option for that. Another one is Agenda Black. So if you want to kind of use a typeface to really jump out on the page or on the screen, you want to use something with a very thick weight possibly to bring the eye in. This is an example of that. Alternate Gothic, this has a bit much kind of more narrow set width, meaning the width of each of these letters are a lot slimmer than for Helvetica. Helvetica has a more generous set width, horizontal scale, right, than alternate Gothic. So sometimes when I'm trying to figure out a typeface to use, and I want to use something that fits this kind of a narrower column, I might use something that has a narrower set width, right? So this might work better than something like Helvetica because I can fit more letters in that narrower column of text and therefore have a larger ability to have larger text to use for a header, but fit in a narrower space than Helvetica, which has a higher or a longer set width or larger set width. All right, so looking at classifications for sans serif, one of them is grotesque. So it has the spurred lowercase g, so that lobe that goes below the baseline here. Minimal contrast and stroke weight, the double story lowercase g, some curves more squared off. You can see the curve here a little bit more squared off, and it's usually a little heavier weighted typeface. Franklin Gothic is an example, as well as News Gothic. Another example of grotesque is Helvetica and Arial. They're a little more legible, more kind of plain, but make it easier to read. Humanistic is, again, just a little bit more of a feel of using a calligraphy pen to it. It's based on proportions of the Roman style capitals, and they were created to be more legible, and they, again, have more of a calligraphic influence. Geometric, as the name suggests, have much more of a geometric shape that defines each of those characters. So if we were to draw a circle or a sphere on the letter G, you can see that it fits very tightly to a sphere. The O as well, even if we just use the descender of the G, has a very cylindrical feel to the lower descender of the G. And then lastly, script typefaces. So again, these are based on more of a cursive type of typeface. Scripts typically are shown as one letter connects to another. So with a script, oftentimes you'll see each of the letters kind of attaching themselves to the next letter, just like cursive. Very often these are great for maybe using to have like a subheader or something like that. Again, you wouldn't want to use this typeface, scripts for large bodies of text. They're more apt to be used for, just kind of headers or subheaders, or maybe like a little subhead that follows a header, something like that. One thing to shy away from is to increase the spacing between script letters. So if you were to increase the space, or in other words, tracking, if you would increase the space between these letters and those letters no longer touch or connected, it's kind of a bad use of a script. You always want to make sure that the script, as intended, each of the letters stay connected. So spacing out those script typeface and spacing out those characters will then break up that letter form, and they're not going to be touching one another as you would, intentionally draw the letters using cursive, right? So that kind of goes against what script is all about. Formal script, this is, again, has a little bit more of a formal feel to it with kind of loops and flourishes on it. In this type, letter forms are generally, again, connected. So you can see they're connected here as we move through each of the letters. Casual scripts. Now these are more kind of maybe, a more like brush-like appearance. Sometimes they're connected, sometimes they aren't. So in a more casual script, you can get away with increasing tracking, although you want to be a little bit leery about spacing those letters out too much, right? Because then it doesn't hold together and the eye can't really differentiate, and makes it more difficult to read those letters. So casual script, save those for headers and subheaders. I wouldn't use those for large bodies of text. But again, with the casual script, they're more brush-like appearance, maybe marker, like somebody drew the letter form with a marker. Sometimes they're connected, sometimes they are not. And then we have the calligraphic. And again, this can be more emulate the hand-lettered calligraphy, generally high contrast. In this, the letters are typically connected, obviously. Another classification that is more specific to more of a display typeface for digital displays is a monospaced classification. So they are non-proportional. Every letter takes up the same amount of horizontal space on the page or screen. So as you can see here, each letter is spaced out the same amount, versus in the others that we have looked at, the proportion of space between letters kind of is different based on if it's a kind of a straight edge going up against a curved letter form. So optically it's spaced out so it looks really proportional. With monospaced, every space between each of the letters is the same. When we look at classification being a display typeface, we've touched on this throughout this lecture. Display fonts are designed to stand out and be easy to read and catch the eye, right? And some are less easy to read, but again, being at a larger size, make them a little bit easier to read as compared to smaller sizes where they start to become much more difficult for the eye to differentiate the letter forms from. So not good to use for body copy, but great to use for larger text or display type. Typically, display type means that it is 14 point or beyond, so 14 plus. So again, using them for headers and larger text. Here we see an example to further kind of differentiate the different terminology here between display type and text type. So I've been alluding throughout this lecture that headlines, or headers or subheaders, those are going to be your larger text sizes, right? They're the kind of call your attention to lead the viewer into that composition, whether it's a poster or an editorial or a two-page spread, right? We want to make sure that we catch the viewer's eye, draw them into where they should start reading as we kind of disperse the information. So display type is that larger text. Typically that starts at 14 point and up, right? So that larger text on the page. And then text type is kind of that body copy. That's that text size that's smaller, typically 8 to 12 point, right? So we see here we've got a headline, a very large typeface, or font size for this typeface. Then we have a little subheader here, and that too is going to be a little larger, so 14 point or larger. Again, used for emphasis and effect and in small quantities. And then we move into text type. That's your kind of body copy. That's the sometimes referred to as galley text, but it's the body of text that's, paragraphs of text is your text type. And so text type is typically, again, 8 to 12 point. And depending on, again, when we looked at that X height in a different lecture, larger X heights might be able to be smaller in size because they, by the fact that they are larger X heights, will appear a little bit larger. Whereas a smaller text or a smaller X height might obviously look smaller, so you might have to punch up that typeface size, so the point size to a little bit larger to accommodate that smaller X height. But again, text height typically is between 8 to 12 point. Keep that in mind because that is something that I will be looking at as I look at your work as you submit that. Display type is that larger 14 point on up for your headers, subheaders, pull quotes, those types of things where you want to kind of make it stand out amongst the text type. Some display type fonts might be Lobster, Alpha Slab, Brandon Grotesque, right? So these are, as you look at them, they're a little bit harder to read in that they have the Lobster regular is all connected and at a smaller size. As that gets smaller, it'll almost look like those letters are connected or almost touching one another, which makes it harder to read. When we look at the Brandon Grotesque, that real narrow contrast in line weight here versus this stem here, or the B is real thick and heavy line weight. You can even see that at a smaller size, it starts to disappear. Those thinner lines of that, thinner strokes or lines of that letter can disappear, which makes it, again, harder to read at smaller sizes. When we look at text type fonts, Garamond, Helvetica, Times New Roman, those have all been tried and true throughout the years, right? Most novels use Garamond or Times New Roman. And if you're using more of a sans serif typeface, Helvetica, Arial, those types are really something that have been used consistently and are easy to read because we have been seeing and reading that typeface for years, right? So if you're reading novels or if you've read novels, you've read large bodies of text that have probably been using Times New Roman. So your eye just can really navigate that and understand the shapes of those and read through that very easily. Same thing with Helvetica, that has been around for such a long time, so easy to read as a sans serif font. So those are some examples and the definition between display type and text type. When we look at some examples of these different classifications being used, these are some, again, uses of display type versus text type. Some really interesting typefaces here that really call in your attention. And also the thing to look at too is how they are combined with another typeface. Really interesting combinations. One of the things that I think about using when I'm looking at typefaces are superfamilies. So superfamily consists of dozens of related fonts in multiple weights and widths, often with both sans and serif versions. So this source sans variable is a superfamily in that it has extra light style, it has light, regular, semi-bold, black, then it has more of a italic version, and then it has semi-bold, bold, black, and then it also has a serif version. So not only in the superfamily does it consist of a serif and also consists of a sans serif, right? So two serif and sans serifs built into one superfamily. The value of this is if you were to be creating a layout for like a multi-page document, you can create formatting for your text to employ kind of one typeface with all these different styles so that you can use one typeface but then use different styles. I could use, the black for my headers, I could use the extra light for my subheaders, and then I could use just the regular for my body copy, right? So these really work well to start off with using if you're really kind of worried about pairing typefaces together, because the super family has all the different typeface styles both for sans serif and serif built into one, so they really work well together. So now that we understand typography classifications and understand the differences between each of those type classifications, it might help you be able to pair typefaces together and look for a fitting typeface for whatever project you're working on.